Welcome. Today we're going to discuss intellectual departure and the relationships between it and other techniques in the American Kenpo system. Now keep in mind this is not designed to be a full comprehensive list or family groupings for that matter, just different avenues in which you can explore so you can understand the structure of the American Kenpo system a little bit better. So before we get into the relationships, let's talk a little bit about history. The yellow belt techniques were actually the last techniques created into the system as an introductory course for the practitioners. And one of the main ideas introduced in this yellow belt curriculum was the concept of being able to defend yourself quickly and efficient, which is going to bring us into our first relationship, the quadrilateral zone concept. So what that means is if we bisect the body vertically and horizontally, we are left with 4 zones that we have to worry about or be able to defend ourselves in. The upper left, the upper right, the bottom left, and the bottom right. So this is where we're going to start our first relationships. So intellectual departure picks up the bottom left of that zone. If we move this on to deflecting hammer, we are now picking the bottom right. And now if we move this to the top, we have something like delayed sword to pick up the top left, and sword of destruction to pick up the top right. So if you notice through these 4 techniques, we're quickly and efficiently able to defend all 4 of those zones. So now that we got through this relationship, let's move on to a bigger relationship, which is used all throughout American Kenpo system, which are opposites and reverse. But before we get into that, let's actually talk about opposites. So think about an opposite. If I do a right straight thrust punch, an opposite of that would be the left straight thrust punch, right? Because left and right are opposites. Well, what if I had done a right straight snap punch? Well, that too would be an opposite because we've changed the method of execution. We went from a thrust to a snap. Well, what if I had done a heel pump? Would that be an opposite? Well, yes, because we went from a closed hand to an open hand. What if I had done a block? Well, another opposite because we went from defense to offense, and we went from the width of the weapon as opposed to the length of the weapon. What if I had done a back elbow? Well, that also would be an opposite because we went from forward to backward, and we went from opposite ends of the weapon. We went from long range to short range. But keep in mind that that also falls into reverses, and we'll get into that as we get into the reverses. But for now, let's see how intellectual departure can relate to other techniques using opposites. So let's take the first maneuver, the inside downward pump down blocker. So if you notice, my arm is vertically, where the hand is below the elbow. We are traveling horizontally. I am using my front hand, striking with the inside of the forearm, and using it defensively. So if we start adding some opposites, we could get something like circling fans, where we get towards the end of the technique, and we're now using our arm horizontally rather than vertically, traveling instead of a horizontal, vertically, still using the inside of the forearm from the front leg or the front hand, but now we've changed the intent to offense rather than defense. So keep in mind when we're talking about opposites, we don't just have extremes. So we don't just have black and white, we have all the colors in between. Those would also be opposites. So let's move this into something like thundering hammers. Thundering hammers, now if you notice, before we were doing verticals and horizontals, now we're going to do a diagonal, which is another opposite. But not only that, we're now moved it from the front weapon to the rear weapon. So we're using the rear hand offensively on a diagonal, still using the inside of the forearm. But this whole time, we've been keeping the hand below the elbow and using the inside of the forearm. Can we do the opposite of that, where we have the hand above the elbow and use the outside of the forearm? Well, if we keep the same intent as intellectual departure, we have something like delayed sword, where we're using it from the front, again defensively, but we're using the outside of the forearm with the hand above the elbow. What if I wanted to change the intent as well and do it offensively? Well, that would put us into something like falling falcon, where we're using the same maneuver, but again, using it offensively rather than defensively. Well, can we combine the two? Can we keep our hand below the elbow, but use the outside of the forearm instead of the inside of the forearm, and use it offensively rather than defensively? Well, yes, this would be something like intercepting the ram, where we get towards the end of the technique, and now using pivot points instead of lines, we're using it on a circular pattern. So now that we got through the opposites, or some of the opposites in there, let's talk about the reverses. So the way to think about reverses is we have a big umbrella term, which is opposites. Reverses are a subcategory of that. Another way to think about that is all reverses are opposites, but not all opposites are reverses. So left and right are opposites, but they're not reverses. Reverses typically deal with 2 things: sequence and direction. And when we get into directions, we have both circular and linear. So let's see how that plays into intellectual departure. So if we take a look at intellectual departure, we're going to be stepping back and using a counterclockwise circle to use our right leg as a back kick from the front. If we do the reverse of that, we get something like flight to freedom, where we're going to be using a clockwise rotation to then do the opposite, using the rear leg, or our left leg in this case, to throw a front kick rather than a back kick, because our toes are going to be up instead of down to deliver that kick. But if you notice, the rotation is what's reversed. So now remember, that's the circular way. So how do we do that linear? Well, again, looking at intellectual departure, we're stepping back with the left. So the reverse of stepping back with the left would be to step forward with the right, and we get something like trigger salute, which again introduces another opposite. Instead of using the lower part, we're using the upper part. So instead of using our feet, we're now using the hand. So now let's talk about sequence. If we finish the technique of intellectual departure, if you notice, we do our initial maneuver, we're then using the upper followed by the lower. So if we take a look at something like checking the storm, we're doing the reverse sequence, where we are now using the lower followed by the upper. But now if you wanted to get a little bit crazier, we can do something like thrust into darkness, where we do a combination of all the things we just talked about, where we are now using that same rotation that we did in intellectual departure, counterclockwise, but to use the rear leg like we did in flight to freedom to throw that front kick rather than the back kick, and then again reversing the sequence by using the side kick and the hand rather than the hand and then the side kick. So to recap, the way we just related intellectual departure was through opposites in reverse and through the quadrilateral zone concept. We hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system a little bit better. Thank you very much.